Well, welcome everybody. Happy Wednesday, Brett. I woke
Yeah.
up today and asked my husband, I said, it's Thursday, right? And he's like, no, it's Wednesday. I don't know why. It just feels like it should be Thursday today.
Well, and I don't remember what it is in Houston, but here in Dallas, we've got this gray weather, and
Hmm.
it's been that way for like 3 straight days. So it feels like Seattle. And
Yeah,
that is the biggest thing that I'm like, what day is it? What time is it? Trying to figure life out. It's kind of tough.
it's so true. Yeah, I would love for you if you're joining us, please pop in the chat where you're joining us from. So I'm in Houston here. I'll lead. I'm gonna put make sure you put to everyone because sometimes it defaults to hosts and panelists. So put everyone. I'm gonna say Houston. Ooh, Sandra, Hawaii. I want to go where you
Hawaii. I
are.
want to, yeah, I was going to say, can we just go there? We should do the next webinar from Hawaii. Yeah, I'm in.
Yeah, let's make that happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, we like so many of you, we had this crazy winter weather, which we say winter in Texas, and Dallas got it pretty bad. Y'all were in like the single digits.
Single
Houston,
digits. I'm not made for that. I don't have clothes for that. I don't have enough coats for that. I had like 3 coats on. I looked funny. It's okay. I'll embrace it.
yeah, we were not prepared for that. Here in Houston, I think it got down, I think 18 was the lowest, which is still crazy for us. But
Crazy.
yeah, we had like this week of winter weather and then now it's been raining. And so tomorrow the sun is supposed to come out and I cannot wait. So that's awesome. Oh, let's see here. We've got Florida, Chicago. I've heard Shakina, I heard that Chicago is just brutal right now. Like
Mm.
the snow and cold hanging there. Some more Florida's New York, California, another Dallas, Virginia, LA, more Florida. We got lots of Florida today. Florida and California. That's awesome. Two of my
Yeah.
favorite places. Buffalo, New York. I bet it's freezing there.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, again, as you're joining, drop in the chat where you're joining us from. And we want this to be engaging today. We are so excited to get to know you better and talk about this exhilarating topic, change management. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll do some introductions, but please do, as we are, learning together today, would love for you to use that chat feature to communicate with each other, learn from each other, share what you're hearing, what's thought provoking for you, and definitely any questions. You can also use the Q&A feature there in the Zoom panel to drop any questions our way. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end to make sure that we dive into questions. So I'm going to pull the chat up in front of us so that I've got it front and center here. Okay, the first question, Brett, I want to ask if some people can get vulnerable with us today.
Yeah, I like it.
So, first of all, everybody on here gets a gold star for attending a webinar about change management. This is one of the number one questions that we get from all of the different organizations that we talk to is, how do I lead my team effectively through change? And so I reached out to you, Brett, because you're so good at this and you've been through this multiple times in your career, which we're going to unpack
Appreciate that.
together. It's true.
Nice.
But I will say it was probably about 15 minutes ago as I was like doing my last minute preparation for our time together today. And I kind of got this feeling of like fatigue. Like it was like I was thinking
Mm,
about change management and I was like, oh man, I feel tired. And so I want to
yeah.
ask if anybody else will be vulnerable like me and drop in the chat just a quick yes. If you kind of felt like coming to this webinar today, you're like, oh my goodness, I know I need to learn this. This is a really important thing, but I kind of feel tired when I think or hear about change. Drop it in chat if that's how you're feeling today. Do you ever feel like that, Brett, when it comes to like thinking about change management? Does it make you feel tired at all?
You know what's really funny is I've conditioned myself. That's how I used to feel. I've conditioned myself to actually get a little bit excited about change management. And we talk about here a lot of just kind of like reframing those thoughts and those feelings. And so without knowing I've done that over the last 20 years, I think I've reframed my brain to think about change management of being excited what's on the other side, and pushing through. Not all the time, I'll admit, but for the most part, I think this is actually something that exhilarates me. I know.
Good.
Nerdy.
Well,
I'm probably
we're
like
gonna
the only
learn.
one. It sounds silly, but whatever.
No, it doesn't sound silly at all. It's well, and that's the thing. I think when we've been through it and gotten to the other side several times, we're like, wait,
Yeah.
okay, I survived. And
Yep.
actually there was some good on the other side of this. And
Yep.
so but I appreciate Paul and Jen put here in the chat. Paul said, I'm just tired. Not related to this webinar.
That's real.
I feel you, Paul. Thanks for sharing. And then Jen says, in the middle of it and worn out, trying to positively anticipate. Thank you for your vulnerability, Jen. I know that you are not alone on this Zoom today. And then Randy says, more excited currently than tired. Way to go, Randy. Love
Cool.
that.
That's great.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, we're excited to bring this to you today because, again, this is what we walk through with our leader customers all day, every day, is change management. And so Brett and I put our heads together to share with you some strategies of how to do this in a healthy way. And then most of all, how to build a culture of change, because it's not just one-off changes. It's how do we build a culture of healthy change. So I'm Holly Tate. I'm our SVP of Growth here at Leadr. I lead our marketing and partnerships team. I've been on the team for almost 3 years, which is wild. And I just feel so lucky to get to do what I get to do every day, which is to be with folks like you guys who are really trying to make sure that you're building a healthy team and healthy organizations. And before Leadr, I was in executive search and staffing. So I've really been trying to solve, people problems from a leadership or team building perspective for, oh goodness, probably 12 years now. And love that I get to do that now here at Leadr. And I'm joined today by Brett, who is our CFO here at Leadr. Love getting to work alongside you every day, Brett. But could you share a little bit of your story and what you do here at Leadr?
Yeah, so this is why I think this is a really helpful topic for me, because in a lot of ways, I am your typical traditional CPA. So that's where I started, Big Four public accounting, worked for a hedge fund, which was a lot of fun. And that was a lot of change as well, constant. And then took a little bit of an interesting turn, went to go work for a large church here in the Dallas area, spent a while there doing finance. And that's where I started managing HR. And I think that's been the biggest key for me of learning that change is inevitable and how you do it matters. So did that for a while. And then for the last 3 years, been doing a little bit of fractional CFO work for a couple startups. And then a year and a half ago, jumped in full time with Leadr. So that's been for the last like 8-9 years, change has been such a constant for me, which prior to that, I would have said, I hate change. I never want to do change. So that's been an interesting part of my journey.
That's awesome. And one thing that I really appreciate about your experience, Brett, is that you've been in both small team settings and also you've led really large team settings. Like when you were leading HR there at that church, it was hundreds of employees. So you've been, across the spectrum in change management. While there are definitely, pillars that can carry us in each of those situations, it can be very different in a team of, 10 versus hundreds of employees. I know we have that represented across the board here today. All right, we're going to start with a question. So here's the question that I want you guys to think about. And I'm going to launch a poll. Bear with me. I've only done this like once before. So I always have to find it here. Here we go. Okay, polls and quizzes. Here it comes. Okay, I'm going to launch the poll. So here's the question. How does your team respond to change? We've kind of done a scale of like 1 to 5 here, 1 being the worst. I'm exhausted, which we had a little bit of that in the chat earlier, which is absolutely okay. And then 5 being like, excellent. Everyone is always gung-ho. So curious to see what everyone says here. We've still got lots of answers coming in, so I'm going to keep it up for about another minute or so. Where would you say, Brett, like as the teams that you've led over your career, where do your teams tend to fall?
It depends. Here's one of the other things, being the accountant side, like whenever I'm doing something really fun on the accounting side, it's like 1 and 2. The whole org is just against me in everything. But then I've also been on the other fun side of things of like rolling out compensation changes, and people get really excited about that. Go figure.
When they're good compensation.
When they're good, yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. You're right. Good clarification. But I would probably put most teams I've led at least in the 3, either bordering on the 2 or bordering on the 4. If anybody's answering 5, I'm excited. Let's go. I'll come join in with you guys.
That's
If
awesome.
you've got people that are always gung ho, that'd be pretty neat.
Well, yeah, it looks like all the answers have come in. So I'm actually going to end the poll here so that we can see the results. Can you see the results on your end? Or wait, I think I have to share. Here we go. Share results. Okay.
Ooh, there we go.
Can you see the results there on your end, Brett?
Yeah, that looks exactly what I would have expected.
I know, that's exactly what you said, which was so interesting. There are, shout out to the 7% of you who your team is always gung ho. That
Way
is
to go.
wonderful. But yes, the majority of us landed there in the resistant, but getting on board eventually. And then we had some, 2s and 4s as well, which is not surprising. And another thing too that was interesting, Brett, we actually did a LinkedIn poll up on our LinkedIn today as well. And most people said resistant. We asked what was the biggest, issue that you're facing when it comes to change management, and resistance was the number one thing. So
Yeah.
not surprised at all that number 3 rose to the top here.
Yep.
Well,
That's
the
real.
good news is you're going to leave here today with some really practical action steps for how not only you can navigate maybe change that you're in or you're about to go through, or that you will in the future one day. And then you're also going to leave with some tips on really how to embed a culture of healthy change into your culture through the employee life cycle. So with that, the first step that is critical in making sure that we are leading healthy change is leadership alignment. And I know that this probably sounds simple, but it's actually one of the hardest parts of change. I think where we tend to have that resistance or frustration lower down the org chart, it's because our leadership has not taken the time to be 100% aligned on what change we're actually trying to achieve here. What is the why? Why are we doing this? Are we all aligned on that? And so Brett and I are going to unpack together this framework that we use here at Leadr, and a lot of our customers use. That is from Patrick Lencioni's The Advantage. It's a book. And so we'll walk through what that looks like and how it's been a game changer for our leadership team. But we also have, if you scan this QR code, we did a webinar, I believe it was last month, which is wild. But yeah, I think it was last month, we did a webinar on how to run effective team meetings where we spent a lot of time unpacking this granularly. So feel free to scan that QR code and watch the replay of that webinar if you want to get really nitty gritty on how to run an effective meeting. But Brett, I'm going to start with a question. Why do you feel like leadership alignment is so difficult when it comes to the change management process?
Yeah, I think my perspective has been, especially on the leadership team, you've got a lot of different opinions, a lot of different strong opinions on how you think this needs to go. And I have never been part of a change, either small or big, that every single person agrees, either agrees on the problem we're trying to solve, agrees that this is the solution that we need to roll out. Getting 100% alignment isn't the goal, shouldn't be the goal, because that just doesn't exist. And so the first big step is making sure that your big rocks, the leadership team, the people that are going to be championing this and behind it, are at least aligned. And that takes time. Sometimes it's a small amount of time. Hey, we need to spend 10, 15 minutes getting there. Sometimes it's weeks or months really agreeing. Like I said, 1, this is the problem we agree we need to solve. And 2, we think this is at least the type of solution we should roll out. It takes a lot of work.
Well, I really appreciate that you use the word agree versus align, because they're different. I think we often use them synonymously, and they, that's not necessarily a bad thing,
right?
But alignment and agreement doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing. And I think that's where we get hung up sometimes. Agreement means that we all agree, go figure, but like that we would all say yes and agree on something. Whereas alignment might be that we disagree, but we're aligned together, running in the same direction as a leadership team, because this is what we as a team have decided. Yep. And that is a critical distinction. I was just talking to a friend recently where they just did a reorg in their company, really, really large company. And I know that's true for probably several that are on here today. There's a lot of companies going through reorgs right now. And they were telling me about the reorg and how they could tell that the senior leader that was rolling this out, that they weren't aligned. They could tell. And this was somebody that was a couple layers down the org chart. And the delivery of what was said, it just felt really fake. It didn't feel, like they really were aligned with the change. And that right there, like that is the number one thing that you can do to disrupt effective change management.
Yeah.
That your senior leadership has got to be aligned and running in the same direction about what's best for the organization or the business together. Doesn't necessarily mean agreement, but it's alignment. And one way that we've gotten there, Brett, as a leadership team is through the Advantage framework. And so
Yes.
I would love if you kind of just share like how this framework has helped you individually and us as an executive team, because Brett and I are on our executive team together, really get more alignment together.
Yeah. So in so many ways, like a lot of times I'm kind of running in my own silo. And so I'm not really thinking about Holly or Matt, our CEO, and what they're focusing on, what their defining objective is. I'm really just focused on mine. It's so easy. Holly and I were just saying this. I'm a one-track mind person. It's so easy for me to only think about one thing at a time. And what I default to is what matters to me. Right. But what happens is when I log into our Leadr platform, which I'm in every single day, and it pop up to that home screen, and this is in front of me, I am reminded of, oh yeah, what I'm working on is part of this bigger picture. And so what I'm working on matters as it plays into what Holly is working on, what Matt or what Garrett are working on as well. And so without that in front of me, without kind of this framework, all I would do is go through my week, only think about financial things, and then show up to our executive team meeting the next Monday and be like, oh yeah, Holly, what are you working on again? But this keeps it front of mind for me.
That's so good. Yeah, we'll even call each other out. We'll be like, okay, today, Brett, you're not a CFO in this meeting, you're a
Yeah,
CXO, which means
that's right.
all of us are representing what's best for the business as a whole and not just our department.
Yep.
So really practically speaking, so we can move on to number two, because I know some of you might be thinking, okay, Holly, we get it, leadership alignment, but like, how do you actually do that? Because it's a really nebulous thing. What we really appreciate about the Advantage framework is first, oh my goodness, I keep skipping ahead. You guys are getting a sneak peek. I don't know why. There we go. Okay. Up here, the thematic goal. So this is what in Pat Lencioni's book, The Advantage, this is what he calls the rally cry. And why this is so critical is because it answers the question, what is most important right now? And with change management, a lot of times we can get really confused, especially as a leadership team, because there might be a lot of reasons why we're making a change. But if we can boil it down to one thing, what is most important right now? And then that will help us cascade that communication to the rest of the team. So that's what he calls the thematic goal or the rally cry. Think about it like rallying the team around a why. That's what that is. And so we really want to make sure that that is front and center for your leadership team when you're thinking about change management. And then he talks about this concept of defining objectives and standard operating objectives. And defining objectives are qualitative. These are the things that move the thematic goal or the rally cry forward. They're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a number associated with it, but it's the thematic goal will not happen unless these defining objectives are achieved. And then your standard operating objective, these are the more quantitative things. These are the ones that have the numbers and metrics. These are what help your organization, or what not help, but like cause your organization or your business to run. These are more metrics driven. And so if you're looking for, if your leadership team feels a little lost, I highly recommend you pick up the book, The Advantage. We've got some great resources too on our website all around it, because we're in partnership with the Table Group and Patrick Lencioni to really implement this well. If you're really looking for, if you feel scattered and misaligned, it's a really great way to align everybody. All right. The second one, Brett. So first, we've got our leadership team aligned. That's the number one thing. We know the answer to what's most important right now and why we're making this change. Then we get to determine our internal stakeholders.
Yeah.
This is critical in rolling out change effectively to the team. Now, one of the mistakes, Brett, I don't know about you, that I see a lot of leaders make is they'll either do one of two things. they'll swing the pendulum all the way to the champions because they don't want to deal with the naysayers. And so they're like,
Right.
I'm just going to build a team of internal stakeholders that are, I know, like me, or are going to like this change, so that I can just kind of barrel it through the organization. Or I'll see organizations swing the pendulum to the other side, and they'll go get all the grumpy people on like a committee or a team of stakeholders because they think they know that they're the loudest and they're going to be the most critical. So they want to, bring them along on the journey ahead of time. But if everybody's a naysayer, that can really help you just lose momentum really fast.
Yeah,
And it's honestly just
totally.
exhausting. So we want to be able to identify key champions and naysayers that are internal stakeholders that we bring along early on in the process.
Yep.
So Brett, I know you've had a couple of examples around doing this
Yep.
practically. So I'd love to hear how you've thought about bringing along internal stakeholders in different roles that you've had.
Yeah, and one of the other issues I think that we run into as well is if we've done one of these two things, either we get all the internal champions on and everybody's excited, and then when we roll out, it kind of falls flat. Or if we've done the opposite, like you said, the naysayers, you just feel like you're beating your head against a wall. You're constantly trying to move a boulder uphill and it keeps falling back on you and you never roll anything out. And because of those experiences, what a lot of people are tempted to do is skip this step, right?
Mhm.
They think, hey, I've got the leadership team involved. We're on board. We're just going to shove this through. I don't care if you like it. I don't care if you don't like it. Deal with it. And I've done that as well. It doesn't work either. And so you've got to take this step, and finding that balance between the two is really, really important. It depends a little bit on what you're rolling out, but one of the examples I was sharing with Holly earlier, like I said, I'm an accountant, and so I have changed accounting systems. I've changed expense management systems. I think that's one of the big ones I've realized. It touches everyone. A lot of people see it as a necessary evil, or they see it as a blocker to getting their reimbursement. And so when I changed, I've done a couple times, changing expense management reimbursement systems, say that 3 times fast, for the whole org. What I finally found was a good balance is I would do kind of a beta test to 10 people with technology. And I would intentionally pick 5 people that I knew would be champions of it. Hey, they love change. They love any new technology. They love to be on the cutting edge, the front end of things. So I'd pick them. What I knew I would get from them is really good feedback, right? They would actually test the product. They would try it. They would try to break it. And then they would give me a ton of feedback of what went well, what they liked, what they didn't like. And that would really help me knowing, okay, is this a system that we're going to be able to use? I would also pick 5 people that I knew would be really difficult for a different reason. I already knew that they probably weren't really even going to open it. They weren't really going to test the product. All they wanted to do was tell me why it was a really bad idea. So they tried to log in one time, have a password issue, and then tell me this will never work, right? But they would get in, they would be using it in theory, and we just have lots of conversations. What it did was it allowed them to feel like they were heard. This change wasn't happening. They weren't being rolled over. They got to be part of the process. And then if I gave them a month or two to really be in the system, by the time I roll it out to everybody else, when people look at them, because both of these two groups of people, you're going to have like 80% of your team looking at one of those two groups, and they're going to be pulled one way or the other by them. The internal champions have been like, yeah, I tested this out. It's really cool. Let me show you. The naysayers had kind of been disarmed a little bit. So they had at least said like, wow, I mean, I had a tough time with the password, but like, I guess it's okay. And so the louder crowd ends up being those internal champions. And so that's what I've found worked really well, while also building kind of my FAQ doc and my rollout plan based on the feedback I heard from primarily the champions in that group.
So good, Brett. So good. And I love how strategic you thought through that. Because the thing is, the naysayers are really valuable. We don't want to just ignore them
Right.
or try to, skirt them under the rug. That's honestly, it usually just makes them be louder.
Yes,
They're
it
against
does.
something. But really getting their feedback, because that's going to help you anticipate the things that are going to be thought, but not necessarily said by other people in the org chart. So you're building your FAQ doc, you're anticipating objections that you're going to see, and then you're building your champion so that they can be your voice when you're not in the room and help galvanize the team around that. I did something similar a couple of years ago when I came to Leadr. Our logo and our brand looked very different than it does today. You know, it was still called Leadr, but it was just a very different visual look. And so one of the first projects that I tackled was redoing that. And so I knew that there had been people who had been at Leadr from the very beginning and were a part of picking that very first logo. And then there were some newbies that hated it, right? And they were like, oh, that's gross, we need to change it. And so really choosing those people that I knew would be naysayers that I needed to bring along on the journey, and then also those champions together before we rolled it out to everybody else was invaluable into making it a really successful rollout process. So that by the time we rolled it out, it was not a big deal because the people who felt the strongest about it had already been brought along on the journey. The thing that I've found, Brett, is with the naysayers, it's often because they're processors. These potentially could be, you know, using working genius languages, you know, maybe these folks are wanderers or our tenacity folks, you know, on the genius, which is Brett, right? And that's what you're so gifted at, like so gifted at looking at all of the reasons why something would not work. And we need those people on the team.
Right.
What happens though is when we ignore them or we don't bring them along, they feel excluded. They feel like their voice is not heard. And that's what can make them sometimes come across as like curmudgeon-y or grumpy. And so that's why this step, number 2, of determining internal stakeholders will be critical in making your rollout process that much better. The one caution I want to say, and this is where I feel like a lot of leaders get this wrong, if you're listening too much to your naysayers too early in the process, and you're letting that make you feel insecure or doubt or question step number 1, right? Which was your leadership team is aligned. I'm going to go back because this is the first step. Once our leadership team is aligned and we know why we're rolling out this change, we're going to roll it out. What we don't want to do is cause that pushback. If we know this is the right thing for the organization, we don't want to cause that naysayer pushback for us to get cold feet or trepidation in rolling this out. We want to bring them along on the journey. We want to hear that feedback, but it doesn't mean that we're going to change our course because of that feedback. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Brett, but that can be, this is where I can see, I see a lot of change management break down in this part of the process because we're too sensitive or insecure as a leader of what we're hearing from our downline. Any thoughts on that?
Again, that's why this is step 2, and step 1 is that leadership alignment piece. Because having that leadership team, again, agree or aligned, having them aligned, this is the path we need to move forward. It's really, really rare that enough of a group of other people would be seeing something that the leadership team isn't. It can happen, absolutely. As a leadership team, we need to be thoughtful. We need to listen to the team. At the same time, if we think this is the right way to go, we need to trust our guts because we're the ones that have been entrusted to lead the teams. And so even when naysayers are allowed, we believe we're aligned, this is the right thing for us to do as a business. Pushing through is really important.
So true. So really practically speaking, for your champions, if you use Working Genius in your organization, these are going to be your galvanizers. These are going to be your enablement geniuses, people who love to rally the team and help the team. Those are going to be your champions. Whereas for naysayers, you might, like, again, what I said, like look for your wanderers, your discerners, your tenacity folks on your team. They're going to be the ones that are going to help you poke holes and think through all of the different pieces to this change that you might not even have thought through. Yeah. And we need both to be able to roll out change really, really well. All right. Number 1, align your leadership team. Number 2, determine your internal stakeholders. Number 3, cascade communication down the org chart. This is where things get to become more complex. I see teams all the time. They're like, all right, we've got our cohesive leadership team. We've got clarity at the top for why we're doing this, but they forget that there's all these layers of people and stakeholders below them that lack all of that context. And so it is our job to be chief reminding officers to really make sure that we are cascading this clearly down the org chart. So an exercise that you and your team should do is, and we do this actually at the end of every meeting. This is a really good practice. The table group and Pat Lencioni call this end of meeting discipline. And it's basically okay, who needs to know what and by when? And so when you're doing change management, obviously this is a huge piece, but it's also a good practice just in the week to week, decisions that you're making as a leadership team. But determine what groups need to know and the order of which those groups need to know. Usually that is, down like a hierarchy of an org chart, not always the case, but typically that's what that looks like. And we'll kind of walk you through an example of that in a minute. And then one way that we've done this through software, why we believe that software is a huge component of effective change management, is we want to make sure that we can always go back to things that are written, remind us of the why. And so here's a couple of examples of what that could look like, that your team might have slightly different messaging depending on what's most important to them right now. Why does this change impact the marketing team? Why does this change impact our leadership team, our product team, whatever it might be? Having those in Leadr are really, really helpful. And then another thing that I found really good to do is, in a time of change, in your one-on-ones that you're having with your team, add a recurring agenda item that shows up on a weekly basis. That's, how can I provide clarity for you this week? And as the leader, it just provides a space for your team members to be able to go, yeah, I'm confused about this, or this didn't make sense, or give you feedback on things that were messaged maybe ineffectively. So adding a recurring agenda item there is a really, really helpful way to do that. But Brett, what are your thoughts on cascading communication down the org chart and how we can do that well?
I love what you just said about asking the question. So many times we're afraid to ask that question because, like, oh, I don't know what the answer is going to be, and I'm a little bit afraid of it. But lean into that and asking them that question of, like, hey, what are you confused about? How can I help remove some of the confusion? Again, you're giving them a voice, and that's the biggest part of what anybody is going to want to know, is that at least they got to speak into it. Even if they don't change the mind, they got to speak into it a little bit. But part of this planning, like when we're going down, okay, we've got the funnel, the inverted funnel, maybe it is, like leadership team down to kind of your champions, and then now to the rest of the team. What I always tell people, when you're planning a change, big or little, how you roll it out is extraordinarily important. You get one chance to do it. More than anything else, this is a trust exercise, right? Because no matter how big or small a change is, most people don't love change. We just saw that in the poll. Like, most people are kind of resistant to change, at least the first they hear about it. And so how we communicate that, we get one shot at it. And so if you mess this up, which is okay, but if you mess this up, you don't get to go back the next week and say, hey, redo. Actually, what I really meant was this. It's just not available. It takes time to build that trust back up. And so spending a lot of time planning out the rollout. What does this look like? How should we do it? How can we move a little bit more slowly than maybe we like to run? Here at Leadr, we run really, really, really fast. But even then, we kind of borrow that old adage from the Army Rangers: slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And that's really important with change.
Yeah. A practical way that we do that, Brett, if this is an encouragement for folks out there, is we do quarterly kickoffs. And it's really just a way for us to provide clarity for our team. But we're often, pretty much every single quarterly kickoff, we're rolling out some sort of substantial change to the team, whether it's through org structure or a new product release, or something with our branding. Like, we're always iterating and changing. And so we start planning for that quarterly kickoff halfway through the quarter before. And we start at the executive level. We want to make sure we're leadership aligned. What are the critical changes that we need to roll out to the team next quarter? And, we don't have a crystal ball, right? It would be nice if we had 6 weeks of advance and all of those things. But as much as possible, we try to anticipate what are those changes that we want to roll out to the team next quarter. We mull on that together for several. We usually do an on-site together, like an in-person on-site with our executive team halfway through the quarter, where we start to dream and plan and talk about the challenges that we're facing together. Then we mull on that for a couple weeks or so. Usually, I would say like three weeks or so. And we're talking about it in our executive team, just kind of letting it settle and iterate as we get more clarity together and through our discussions. Then once we're aligned, that's where we then start talking about it into what we call our leadership team. And that's anybody who's a manager in our organization. Now, we're only about 75 or so employees. I know some of you are hundreds of employees and some of you are 10 employees. So this is going to look different in every context. But the point is, we know that we need to start bringing, once we have clarity about where we're going, we need to start bringing our managers along, because it's really critical that, and even if it's still fuzzy, like we might not have full clarity, but we're like, hey, this is the direction we're going in. Here are the 3 kind of changes we're thinking about. Wanted to communicate that to you now, ask questions. This is us getting those internal stakeholders bought in. And then we usually do that for about another 2 to 3 weeks. And then that leaves us about another 2 to 3 weeks before kickoff for us to solidify communication, solidify, how we're rolling it out, making sure we're all on the same page, getting that FAQ document that Brett mentioned to all together, so that we're all singing from the same songbook. And even still, you'll run into resistance or hiccups, but we found that that's just a really great process to start early so that you can let things, kind of rise to the surface and settle as you go. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Brett, but it takes a lot of patience.
It does. It takes a lot of patience. And the other thing I want to add to that is that when you do that enough times and you show your team, you're going to get a lot more buy-in on any change. Like when you're showing them consistently, hey, we value your feedback. We want to roll this out slowly. You build that trust, like I said. And then at times, so while we do that, that is our consistent way we communicate down the org chart. There have been a couple times when we have to pivot really fast. We would love to kind of take the 6 weeks to roll out a change. We just don't have that time. And either overnight or within a couple days, we kind of change a big thing that we might have just rolled out 3 weeks ago as a new quarterly objective. And we're scrapping that completely and we're doing something different. And because we've gone through that process multiple times, you can do that occasionally. You can have those faster pivots because, like I said, it's about building the trust. And so doing it really well multiple times, you'll see those naysayers start to soften up. You'll even see your team be a little bit more open to change because they know they can trust you to do it well.
So good. I had a leader one time tell me that he needed to cash in some trust chips. And but that's just not how it works. Like it takes a long time to build up that trust. I've found that you've got to make at least 3 deposits before you can make a withdrawal. And so your point, Brett, there of like, as much as possible to be diligent when you can plan ahead. I think where I see teams the most disengaged and frustrated, it's because their senior leadership is constantly flying by the seat of their pants. Yeah. And it kind of is just like, oh, well, we're the leadership team. It should just be like what we say goes. But you're going to burn out your team and bulldoze them in the process and have really hinder your growth if you're not intentional at the times where it doesn't have to be everybody running around with their hair on fire. Sometimes, like you said, you do have to make those changes that are last minute. And when you build enough trust, your team will come alongside you because you've taken the time to bring them along when it was more planned and intentional. So good. All right, number 4. This one is more of an art than a science. But this is really navigating the tension of transparency versus discretion. This is one of the hardest things I find as an executive of how do I share with my team enough, especially the younger generations, really value vulnerability and transparency without giving too much information, because there's just some things that they don't need to know or that might scare them, or that, if it has to do with finances or if their job is on the line, right? Like with reorgs or restructures or layoffs, right? It's really difficult to find this balance between transparency and discretion. So this is definitely more of an art than a science, but Brett and I wanted to give a shout out to our fearless leader, our CEO, Matt Tressiter, who we really believe does this well. And he shared this with us before and with our entire staff. This is kind of how he thinks about this idea of transparency when it comes to change management. So Matt says, I'm 100% vulnerable with my spouse, right? Like that's, Kaisa is his sounding board, is his partner. when he can talk to her about anything and everything, right? And then with his co-founder, he's 95% vulnerable, right? Because they want to be, they're, super in sync and locked in and aligned. But at the end of the day, there does need to be a little bit of discretion there because they're in a business relationship as well. And then 80% vulnerable with his leadership team. So that would be like me and Brett, their executive team. We don't expect Matt to be 100% vulnerable with us. That would be probably not healthy and unreasonable. But we do expect for him to be more vulnerable and more transparent with us than anybody else in the team. And then about 60% vulnerable with the wider company. And so obviously, this is not a magic formula. This is just to kind of give us an idea of when we're thinking about transparency and discretion. And what's really cool about the way that Matt leads is from a company perspective, he's very open and transparent. This is the most transparent company I've ever worked for, which I really appreciate that. And so 60% with the wider company is pretty high compared to what I see a lot of leaders do, which is like 20% or 10%. And that's why change can be so difficult because your frontline employees have never seen the human side of you. And so if you're standing in front of them rolling out a change that might be really hard for them, but you're pitching it as this very exciting new thing, you're eroding trust because they don't believe you. And so to be able to figure out that version of transparency that you want to operate in as a leader is going to really help you when it comes to change management and rolling that down the org chart. So Brett, what are your thoughts on this? I know you work closely with Matt as well, and probably have lots of thoughts about transparency and discretion.
I do. And I'm glad you said it. It's the art, not a science. Again, in so many ways, I'm the quantitative person. I want you to tell me exactly what to say. We were even, before we jumped on, I told Holly, I'm like, if somebody could just tell me exactly what to eat and at what time to eat that, like, I love it. Just remove all decisions for me. I am just such that person of the science. And this really, really is an art. You've got to know, even within your team, within your company, your org, building that trust takes a long time. We keep talking about that word trust, and finding that balance. It takes time, but lean into it too. I think that's the other thing Matt has learned, and we've all learned watching Matt, is him sometimes maybe oversharing, and sometimes not. And sometimes like, oh, I wish I had shared that earlier because then you guys might have had some of the context. Here we are. You're going to miss a little bit on both of those. And just having that relationship with the people around you, I think that also makes it more human. And we all want to work with other humans, not with robots. So I've learned. But so I think it's really important to try this, even if it's unnatural. It's unnatural for me. This is not something that's easy for me to do. I like to have like almost two different split personalities of like who I am as a person and then who I am as CFO in work. And we don't work that way. That I think that was a lot of people in the workplace 30, 40 years ago, but now it's just not what people want to work with and work for. So we've got to find that balance of not flipping all the way on the other side of sharing all the emotions all the time. But how do we be a little bit more relational with one another?
Yep, that's awesome. Well, just practically speaking, the QR code here is a book that Matt and our co-founder Chris wrote, and he talks a lot about, this is directly taken from this book, this 100%, 95, 80, and 60 is a concept that he talks about in his book. So check it out. Great to read alone or with your leadership team. It's one of my favorites, but also I am biased. So the QR code will take you there. And then another really practical thing to think about around transparency versus discretion is make sure you have a written communication plan. And so this enables you to constantly point people, especially your mid-level managers, back to the fact of here's what you can say, here's what you cannot say. It gives them a sandbox to play in. And so again, this is critical when it's things like layoffs or pay changes or reorgs or more of those sensitive changes that you need to roll out. It is critical that you have a written communication plan at every level of the org chart. That's going to save you a lot of headache later, because we all know you can have 10 people in a meeting and have 10 different perspectives of what was communicated. So you really want to write it down so you can continue to drive people back to those FAQs and the communication plan when you're rolling out change. All right, I've got 2 slides left. So if you've got, we've got some great questions that are coming in to the hosts and panelists. And so I'm so excited to be able to unpack these together. But if you've got more questions, drop them in the chat, drop them in Q&A, and we will get to those in just a second. Okay, so then Brett and I were talking about, we've kind of gone through here these, 4 different steps from leading a big change in your organization. But how do you create a culture of change so that those big changes aren't as big of a heavy lift when they happen? And so we want to make sure if we're, especially if we're in an organization that has a lot of change, here are some really practical things we can do to make sure that change is accepted and expected within our cultures. So first is when we're interviewing, we want to make sure that the job description includes some sort of verbiage that says other duties as expected, or we all pitch in to get the job done, or something like that, so that you can actually interview and hold the person accountable when they take the job, because it's in their job description. Because how many of you have had someone say, well, that's not my job, or that's not in my job description? And so that's why it's really important, if you want to have a culture of change, that you include this in the job description. Okay, the next one is publicly rewarding, leading, and responding to change. I know this is a lot of words, so let me unpack this because I'm pretty passionate about this one. One of the best things you can do to create a culture of ongoing change is in your all staff meetings, or maybe it's a quarterly highlight or reward. You are acknowledging those champions on the team who have either led or responded to change in a positive way. That what gets rewarded gets repeated. I know it's cheesy, but it's true. What gets recognized or rewarded gets repeated. And so when you as a leadership team acknowledge in front of everyone, when, Brett, we know you spent months in picking a new expense management software, and you had, hundreds of hours of meetings. You looked at 20 different vendors. And, thank you so much for leading that change really well so that we can all have better visibility into our expenses as a company, right?
Yeah.
Like really making sure that you're acknowledging why that was done well, and rewarding it in front of everybody is going to help show, not just tell the behavior that you want on the team. The third one is a core value. Make it a core value. If change is something that is happening all the time, for us, we have a value called leaders operate with blue collar DNA. And so for us, that means, and literally the subtext in there is, we're not afraid to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty, right? It's like, no matter what it is, we're all here to pitch in and get the job done. So making it a core value and then reviewing on it through the performance review or development plan to hold yourself and your team accountable for living out that core value that models change is a really great way to provide accountability through the org chart. And then lastly, this is what we're a big believer in here at Leadr, is in one-on-ones, making sure that you're revisiting change on a regular basis. You might have people on your team that want to change everything all the time. Sometimes that's me. So I might need a one-on-one recurring agenda item that's, Holly, what did you not change this week? Whereas you might have other team members who don't want anything to ever change. And maybe it's a challenge to them to say, what's something you noticed that needs to change this week, to really help get their wheels turning and thinking more about change as a positive thing. So Brett, you lead HR on our team, and recruiting and interviewing and hiring and offboarding and all the things. So what would you add here that I've missed today?
Yeah, one of the practical things I think is so underdone in every org is in this interview and job description process. We do what's called a culture interview. So when we're looking at different candidates, absolutely we're looking at competency. Can this person accomplish the job we're going to ask them to do? One of the other important things we've done is, hey, is this somebody that we think would fit well with the culture we've cultivated here at Leadr? Can they handle change? Can they handle pivots really fast? Because we do often. And if we have people on the team that can't move or get really stuck and entrenched, even if they are the best salesperson, whatever it is in the company, it's going to be really, really difficult. The craziest part to all this is we have actually passed on candidates because of the culture interview. I think it's something that is scary to do because you think, oh, we've got this one person, they'll be great at the job. Sure, they may not really fit our culture, but we just need them in seat. And that is a short-term trade-off because ultimately they're going to become one of those naysayers and change. You're going to be working towards something and they're going to be pulling you back. And that is so difficult. And so as tough as it is on that front end, really letting the culture interview not just be something that's like a check mark. Oh, I guess we have a culture interview. It's fun. Carrying weight to that as much as the competency side of the interview as well.
So good, Brett. So good. All right, we've got some awesome questions coming in. So we've got 10 minutes. So I want to make sure we get to them real quick before we as we're hopping to questions, some other resources for you. I know we've loaded you guys up with resources today. We love QR codes and free resources here at Leadr. On the left-hand side, we've got a great blog that's 5 tips to leading your team through change. So if you want to check that out, discuss it with your team, you can do that there. And then on the right side, you can book a demo to see the Leadr Advantage in action, which is our partnership with Patrick Lencioni and the Table Group. It's what we looked at in that first screenshot of how you can implement your leadership alignment and cascade clarity throughout the organization so that you can increase results. So it's free for anybody to check out the platform and see what you think. Okay, Brett, I actually want to start with, I love that Chris was like, I second Haley's 2 questions. Yeah, Haley, your questions are awesome. Thank you for sending them in. I want to start with Haley's most recent question, because Brett, I think you'd have some good thoughts on this. Her question, it was around like interviewing for culture. Do you ask behavioral questions? How do you determine if a candidate can handle change well? Any tips or tricks on that?
This is gonna be a really funny one. I think what people tend to do is they think I'm gonna ask a behavioral question. Like, oh, tell me a time about when you had to respond to change. That's a fine question. It's not going to get what you want out of a culture interview. So instead, we say things like, hey, would you rather have queso coming out your nose or guacamole coming out your ears? And it's an interview question that nobody's ever prepped for. And so what you get is, hey, how does that person respond when they're put on their heels a little bit? And so some of that's the behavior that we look for. And that's just a silly one, but the would you rather questions, we do a lot. Or just, hey, what's your favorite joke that you heard most recently? Getting people to kind of, one, it helps them loosen up in an interview. And then 2, if somebody takes themselves too seriously, it's one of the things we're big on here. If you take yourself too seriously, you're not going to fit in. And so if you can't kind of have some of those joking things back and forth, you're probably not going to be a great fit for our culture. So instead of asking behavioral questions, do things to where you can observe their behavior. I think that's one of a tricky thing to do, but if you can get that right, that helps your culture interview a lot more than just asking the questions.
So good. And obviously the answer to that question is queso coming out your nose, because then you can just stick out your tongue and it drops into your mouth.
Queso. Oh man, but well, we can go into that. I guacamole all the way, but whatever.
I mean, I love guacamole, but if it's coming out your ears, you can't eat it. If it's coming out your nose, the queso is coming out your nose, just, anyways, that's kind of gross. I love that. Another thing too, a couple other ideas. One is I probably wouldn't do this on the first interview, but if this is a candidate you're highly, highly considering, maybe it's a few interviews in, change the location or the time, or the setting, like change something about the interview at the last minute to kind of see how that person responds or reacts. Another one I've heard, again, this is like, you don't want to, manipulate people or anything like that. But another thing I've heard is if it's for a very high level role, take them out to lunch and ask the server to bring them the wrong meal and see how they react in that way. So yeah, there's a few things like that you can do. And then I was actually just talking to my team this morning about Adam Grant, his book, The Originals. It's pretty old, but it's so good. He talks about how rather than asking behavior questions, you can ask things about, like, for example, people who are more change resistant are going to default to like default things. So for example, like your browser on your computer, people who are a little bit more innovative and change forward, they're going to download a different browser that comes, that doesn't default onto their computer, right? Whereas folks who are more risk averse are probably going to go with like the default of what comes, whether it's Internet Explorer or Safari or whatever. And so again, it's not perfect, but he kind of walks through some examples of how you can kind of dig for that innovative or change forward thinking in ways that doesn't just ask the question. So
I feel like you're taking shots at me for still using AOL.
I know.
My AIM name. Is that true? Man,
No comment.
I need to change it. I'm trying.
Oh my gosh, that's so good. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop talking as much because we have so many good questions coming in.
Great.
Okay, so we have someone asked, Brett, this is another good one for you, and we can kind of do this at a high level, but what are the key components of your culture interviews? So if you kind of want to just highlight that quick.
Yeah, so we have different people doing them than the hiring manager. So that's one of the key components is you're changing people up. And the people doing them are not necessarily managers. They're not even hiring managers. A lot of the people doing the culture interviews are on our front lines. They're our individual contributors. They're trying to get a sense for, hey, would I want to work sitting next to this person? So that's one of the things we do is changing up who the interviewers are. One of the rubric things we do with that team too is evaluate it based on this. Would you want to go get on a car trip with that person? Would you want to take a 4-hour car ride with that person? Because if the answer is no, then you probably don't want to work 8 hours a day next to that person as well. So one is the who, changing that up, it not just being a hiring manager. Number two is some of the rubric of what you're looking for is different than the competency, can they do their job types of questions. And then giving people a lot of freedom to ask questions that they want to ask. Now, this comes with time. I would not just take some person that's never done an interview before and say, hey, go ask them any questions you want. That could end up going really poorly for you, especially because there are still laws in interviews and what you can and cannot say. But giving people the freedom to loosen up a little bit. And this looks different than I would. I love it. I am not a culture interview person. They don't let me do culture interviews because that's really not my strong suit. It's other people's strong suits. And I've walked by a couple times and I've heard them doing one. I'm like, man, that's a brilliant question. I don't know how I'd answer that. So finding those people that you're like, ooh, you'd be really good at this, and tapping them on the shoulder to do it and letting go, I think is good.
That's awesome. We got several questions around culture interviews. So thank you for sharing. And there were even some thoughts from other people in the chat. Okay, Sandra asks, we try to include a balance of stakeholders, but to get things done, we can't include all of them, which causes some people to feel left out, ignored, and then consequently resistant to change. How do you address that? Brett, what do you think?
Because you can't. I would love to get everybody on board. Everybody is bought in. Everybody becomes a key champion before we even roll it out. It just doesn't happen. And so that's a great question. At the end of the day, you're going to have that. Like, you're going to have to just acknowledge there are people that will want to be involved in this decision-making process, and they're not going to be. And that's a bummer. Now, depending on the type of change you have and how often you have changes, rotating in the different people you're picking to be on that front lines, I think can be really helpful. Don't just go with the same people over and over again. Mixing in, one, you want different opinions. And then two, it allows different stakeholders to be involved in at least one or two changes throughout their time at the company. And so don't try to just get everybody on board. It's not going to work. And you, as a leader, you just have to acknowledge, yep, sorry, I understand you didn't get to share your opinion, but we value you.
That's so good. And maybe leave some time after the changes rolled out, one-on-one time, open your calendar and be available to be able to give time to process. That's another great way to build trust afterwards as well. Okay, back to, so Haley's first question, she said, and I'm very passionate about this one. So thank you for asking this, Haley. As a middle manager, is there something we can do to help influence up problems we see at our level being closer to the day-to-day work? I'm speaking with an executive about a problem. I could tell they did not agree it was a problem. And I think this is due to their lack of visibility to the day-to-day operations. So Haley, definitely this is an art, not a science. It's so hard to lead up well. My encouragement would be to start more casually. I think sometimes we can make the mistake lower down the org chart where we are so passionate. We see something and we hold on to it for so long. So we're waiting for that executive to like see it and do something about it. So I would start with, hey, can I have, a couple minutes of your time? I wanted to share an observation that I had. Kind of plant the seed just more casually with that executive, just a couple minutes. And then if you feel their resistance, maybe a couple weeks later, you find some data or some anecdotes, and then you're like, hey, I wanted to circle back to that conversation we had. I actually had, got some data that I gathered here to help show that this might be something we should consider. And just kind of drip, drip, drip is what I find can work really well. So that would be my initial thought, rather than coming out strong with like this big proposal and da 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 da. I think dripping it over time is a really great way to help lead change up. And then we are right at time. I think those were the main ones. We had one about practical tips on how to have difficult conversations. There's a great book called Crucial Conversations. Highly recommend. It is wonderful. And then I saw John actually just put, Clay Scroggins' book, How to Lead When You're Not in Charge, is really, really good as well. I think we covered the majority of our questions today. Thank you everybody for joining us. It was so good to spend time with you. If you got follow-up questions, feel free to ping us, and we'll be sending out the replay link right after this so you can unpack with your own team. Brett, thank you for all your wisdom today. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Holly. Bye, everyone.
Bye.